I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is Goose 2. Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name is Taylor, and I'll be one of your hosts today. And joining me here in a few minutes or seconds will be Tanner. But first, let's thank new patrons, Nathan and Anna. Thank you very much. We appreciate your patronage. Hopefully you appreciate the extra content that we put out. So, also, I want to say a belated, very belated at this point, congratulations to Charles for winning our 2024 Fantasy Football League. We'll probably look to do some more of that kind of stuff here, maybe with March Madness coming up. So be on alert. And I think Tanner is going to jump in now with another announcement.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw this in here. We've been more active in our Discord this season. It has existed for a while. We haven't really done a lot with it. We've been more active with it, though, the last couple of weeks. We'd like to keep that going. So in the interest of that, we have made the Discord available to all patrons now. That includes the free Stowaway patrons on Patreon.
Is that what you named the free tier?
I couldn't figure out how to actually name the free tier, but I would have. They added the free tier to Patreon, and I don't think you can delete it, or at least not easily. So since I can't get rid of it, I figured might as well add some reason for its existence there.
Right.
So literally just by joining as a free patron, you can enter the Discord and you can engage with our lovely fan/us community on there. It's still picking up on there, but there's some good stuff going on there, some good discussion. I've been trying to use it to drop little extra bits related to the episodes, things that either got left out or forgotten, or things that come up later that we discover, whatever it may be. There's some good stuff going on the Discord. So check us out over there if you are a patron, or even if you're not, you can literally jump on for free and you get access to the Discord.
Cool. Let's see. It's time for media check-ins. I'll go first. What have I been doing? I've started a new book, The End. Its full title is The End, The Defiance and Destruction of Hitler's Germany by Ian Kershaw. And I'd never read anything by him, but I looked him up and realized that he's like one of the most preeminent scholars of Nazi history and things like that. And his specialty is kind of looking at why the resistance went on for so long when it was obvious that Germany was defeated. And that's specifically what this book looks at in detail. And it's really interesting seeing ways that it's similar to what we saw with Japan, and then ways that it's different. Like we're talking about before this, it talks about the civilian population, and it's interesting to see how the civilian population is portrayed there versus how we do it with Ukrainian or Russian or, whatever civilians today. So it's a very interesting read. It just looks at some stuff from a unique point of view and showing how much resentment by the end of the war there is for the Nazi Party, yet no one's willing to actively defy it.
I'm looking at Ian Kershaw's works on Wikipedia, and it's an interesting progression because he has two right at the beginning about Bolton Priory, Rentals and Ministers, and Bolton Priory, the Economy of a Northern Monastery. He has one about the Great Famine and Agrarian Crisis in England, 1315 to 22. And the rest of it is just wall-to-wall Nazi stuff. About the Nazis. And he has one other snuck in there about Bolton Priory. So he has his little pet project there also. But yeah, this reads honestly like the TV guide for the American Heroes channel or something, where it's just all Hitler all day.
It's interesting seeing what it breaks down into, and what it kind of always is in Nazi Germany, is these various silos of power all sort of backstabbing each other, trying to make sure that no one gets the upper hand, but also trying to keep the whole Nazi project going. I can only imagine how thinking about stuff like that could be applicable today.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that's always important to remember. Like, a lot of the Nazis hated each other just as much as they hated anyone else. Like, they will stab each other in the back.
Maybe not just as much as they hated.
Some
might
of
have
them,
been
maybe.
some people they hated worse. Like any group of more than like 4 people, it's not going to be a monolith. It's gonna develop, factionalism and infighting. And we've talked about this before. Like, obviously, there's the evil core, but a lot of them are sort of draped in just really goofy, either personalities or behaviors. Probably the drugs they were all on probably wasn't helping that.
It's been a very interesting read. I definitely would recommend that to anyone. The other thing I've been up to lately, since I think we recorded last, is I was lucky enough to see the Drive-By Truckers, so that was cool. Me and Darcy went and did that. It's cool to see a band like that. That's kind of a more of like a guitar, like true rock band, I guess you would say. It was a fun energy.
Gotta go see one of them guitar rock bands.
Yeah, it's the 50s. But you know what I mean, like people that are actual musicians, like that.
Going to the sock hop.
It was a good show, though. It was a lot of fun. The closest thing you could do to seeing Lynyrd Skynyrd, probably.
I think the closest thing you could do to seeing Lynyrd Skynyrd actually happened a few weeks ago on the Potomac River. I remember one year we were at Summerfest. It might have been the year that we saw Flogging Molly. Oh, also, I saw Dave King is like in really bad
Yeah,
shape.
I saw a post about that. That sucks.
I think it was maybe the year that we saw Flogging Molly, but I think Lynyrd Skynyrd was going to be at one of the stages, which is like a depressing thing to think, like watching, 2008 era Lynyrd Skynyrd at a side stage at Summerfest.
Right. Yeah, with like whoever's there. I don't even know if there's any original members at that point. Is there?
I think there's some, but they're old. I mean, by this point. Who will finally fall first, Neil Young or Lynyrd Skynyrd?
Neil Young is still alive, right?
I think so. He's probably a old man. Take a look at my life. I went kind of Hank Hill there.
It was like one of those weird AI videos where Hank Hill sings
Bobby?
like Bodies or something.
What am I looking for? Neil Young is Neil Percival.
Percival's his middle name?
Neil Percival Young.
Huh.
Yes, he is alive and he is 79. Very cool.
Yeah, we've learned something here. What have you been up to?
I have been reading, but it's been a lot of the same stuff I've been working on. I did finish that book about the Scottish Wars of Independence.
Nice.
The Scottish War of Independence, the extremely partisan one, which was it was a fun, like, sort of unique style of history to read. It was a bit frustrating because, like, I liked the writer MacLeod's or Barron. I liked his writing style, but the problem was sort of the focus of the book, as I mentioned, was it was almost more about historiography. It was more about sort of unraveling some myths that had kind of developed over time and misconceptions. And so it was very granular in its analysis of things and saying, well, the received knowledge of, the Earl of Dunbar is that he acted treacherously after the Dunfermline Council of 1296. And then it'd be like, but an analysis of, the wedding register from Westminster and the subsequent summer reveals that he was also present at this gathering of barons. It is interesting in the sense that he is showing his work of like how he is building his interpretation of these events and how they should be read. The book could be a lot shorter.
It's not written like Eric Larson would write it, is what you're saying?
If he just occasionally was kind of just like, okay, so this is what happened, trust me. But he does show all of his work, and that can be interesting, certainly at times, certain events. The last probably 70 pages are all about the Battle of Bannockburn. And so like that was really interesting. I really liked the concluding parts of it. So it was a good read. It was interesting, but it was frustrating because he would just straight up skip parts, famous, well-known parts of the story, because he'd be like, well, this part of the story is very well known, so I won't tell it here. No, I want to hear you tell it. Like, that's why I'm reading this book.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of the book I read about Operation Barbarossa. It was like too much. It was getting to a granular level, like what was going on, and like I was missing the forest for the trees.
Mm-hmm. So I did finish that. I am still plugging away at the Vortex, which I've been reading for a while. I kind of like set it aside for bits and then picked it up, and I'll read 3 or 4 essays in a day. Still reading Gift of the Devil, that Guatemala book. So among all that, I've been doing a lot of pod work, and while I've been working on pod stuff, I've been listening to some pods. I've been very into guerrilla history recently. That's like guerrilla history, not a zoology podcast.
Not Coco the gorilla.
Very good. It's hosted by Henry Huckmackie, I think it's how his name is pronounced, and Adnan Hussein. And I forget how the show was sort of built, but basically a proletarian history podcast, looking at, it's essentially a history podcast that analyzes things through a Marxist-Leninist lens, which makes for a lot of really cool history. They have some really great guests. It's a pod where like they always or almost always have a guest.
Mm-hmm.
Alexander Avinia has been on there a ton of times. His episodes are all really good. They just have a lot of great guests. They have some great connections to come on there. So they talk a lot about, they pretty frequently talk about China. They talk about Korea a lot. Latin America comes up quite a bit. So all places of interest. And in particular, as I've been sort of listening through some older ones, trying to get, caught up, they had a 4-part series where they talked with Ken Hammond,
mm-hmm.
who's an author and researcher, about the history of modern China. And so this started in the late 1700s. And so that gets you sort of jumping into the Opium Wars. And then from there, the Taiping Rebellion, they cover pretty extensively there. The Boxer Rebellion, and then getting into 20th century China, of course, getting into the Revolution, the Civil War, after the communists take power. Then you get into your Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, and then kind of the last big focus was on Deng's reforms. So it was a very deep dive, so several hours of stuff on here, and it's one of those podcasts where it is very guest driven. The hosts are really cool, really knowledgeable, but it is very guest driven.
That's kind of fun. So you get some different.
You'll kind of almost forget that there are hosts, because the guests will be talking and kind of going, and just kind of let them go, and it's really cool because you really do feel like you are sitting in class or something in a good way. So I've really been enjoying guerrilla history. I've listened to it for a while, but I wanted to sort of go back and catch up with some, especially ones that are still particularly relevant, because it's been on for a few years. So I've been enjoying that for some of my history fix. And then Katie and I watched the Andrei Tarkovsky film Solaris, or Solaris. She got it for me on the Criterion Blu-ray for
mm-hmm.
Christmas. So we checked that out. I had never seen it before.
Nice.
Really enjoyed it. It's very, I guess, minimalist, I guess you could say. It's like, there's parts where there's very little dialogue. It's very like concept, and it's very psychological.
Uh-huh.
It's like a sci-fi, a lot of psychological drama on there. They do a lot with a little in terms of like effects, because it's from 1972, I think.
Is it a Russian film, actually? Like,
yeah.
Is it in Russian?
Yeah, and that's the same. He also directed what's his other big one? Stalker, I think, is his other big movie.
Interesting.
But yeah, really enjoyed that. It's one that I'm glad I've seen. It's kind of just a big like cultural piece.
All right. Well, shall we talk Shipwreck?
Let's do it. We get a couple here, I think.
Yeah, this is if you like shipwrecks, you get your value in this episode. So today we will be talking about the HMS Prince of Wales. Normally I was asking if you're familiar with them. I'm assuming you are, considering you've read a good bit of Ian Toll.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is going to happen in kind of an interesting period in the war, especially for American listeners, because we don't ever hear about this.
Right.
incident or this event. And it actually is, it's a pretty crucial turning point in the Pacific early on. Things are not looking good for the home teams.
I think especially because this one's especially interesting because like there's certain things where Americans we don't really know that much about because it's before we're in the war. So, that does how does that affect us?
Like Dunkirk or something like that.
Even just like the invasion of Poland, the
Mhm.
Soviets and the Nazis invading Poland is because aside from the fact that it happened, I don't think a lot of Americans, myself included, know that much about like how that happened and the fact that there was, Polish resistance to that. And so this one's interesting because it does sort of technically happen while we're technically in the war, I guess, against our wishes, certainly. But
we show up at like the very, very end of the story.
we kind of have a lot of shit to deal with right now. So like we're kind of not focused on this arena.
Yeah, so I guess the thing we're kind of alluding to is like this takes place in the shadow of Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
So not really registering on the American psyche. Kind of like, I don't know. I know there's always examples you can find like post 9/11, like in the week after 9/11, like these, fairly significant events happen and they don't even get thought about because of what was going on. I'm sure it's a similar situation here.
I think we have probably referenced before, but I think you've brought up like Ahmed Shah Massoud dying, like the day before.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Not dying, but being blown up by a camera crew and dying in the process. But yeah, like if you were a person who, if you were someone who, had eyes on Afghanistan, if that was your area of expertise or interest, that would have been the big, like, oh my God thing that happened. And then like the next day, like something else just blows it out of the water.
So let's dig into the background of the Prince of Wales. She's built at Camel Laird Shipyard in Birkenhead, England. Laid down on January 1st, 1937, completed on March 31st, 1941. Dimensions, she's pretty big, 745 feet long, 103 foot beam, with a draft of 34 feet. So she's big, but it's not like an Iowa-class battleship or something like that. This is still built within treaty limits, which we'll touch on some of that, which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with.
Somewhat. Yeah, I know it has come up before on episodes. So
armament-wise, what are we dealing with here? So she's got 2 quad 14-inch guns and 1 twin 14-inch gun. So as far as the primary batteries, that's what you're working with. They have 3 total turrets, 2 of which have 4, and then 1 has 2 guns.
Does a quad 14-inch gun means 1 turret with 4 barrels?
Correct.
Is that what I'm reading?
Correct. It's always weird. I'm so used to seeing like the Iowa class for like a battleship that seeing something that isn't symmetrical, like 3 and 3 is weird. As far as secondary weapons go, she has 8 twin 5.25-inch dual purpose guns. These are capable of surface and air engagement. That's what dual purpose is standing for there. So they can fire high explosive shells or airburst shells and stuff like that. But they're also capable of engaging if they were within range of a U-boat or something like that.
Every gun is a dual purpose gun. You could use it to shoot another person or yourself.
If you try hard enough. Let's see. She also has 4 sets of octuple 2-pounder AA guns. I'm assuming that's 8 of them stuck together. 3 sets of 20-barrel anti-aircraft rockets. So literally, like, this thing has rockets to attempt to shoot down aircraft, but this is pre-World War II, so that's kind of sketchy, and it ends up being replaced by an additional 2-pounder AA gun.
Something that they know actually works.
Yeah, something that they know works. And then additionally, for anti-aircraft, they have 1 40-millimeter Bofors gun.
Bofors, D's nuts.
She also came with 4 aircraft. She had 4 Supermarine Walrus seaplanes. They'd be launched via catapult.
It's like a terrible name for a plane.
Right, the Walrus.
These are catapult launch. So are these like scout planes?
Yeah, they're there for scouting, range finding when she's using her main guns. I mean, they're capable of engaging at 15, 16 miles. So They have aircraft, spotting and stuff like that too.
Walrus, just not a great name for what that plane is for. I imagine a walrus being like loud and slow.
I would want it to be like the albatross or something.
Or like gannet, I guess, is already a type of plane. But, some type of bird maybe. Or even like sea leopard or something.
Although not fitted at her launch, she would have 4 radar systems installed to help with navigation and range finding for weapons. So let's talk about the Washington Naval Treaty. This is an attempt to regulate and limit the size of naval vessels being constructed in the aftermath of World War I, when every country said we never want to do that again. The treaty was the product of the Washington Naval Conference, and that occurred between November 21st, 1921, and February 1922. The main target here is battleships, battlecruisers, and aircraft carriers. British ships were limited to a displacement of 35,000 tons, and guns no larger than 16 inches. There's different limits for different countries, but do you want to guess the other country that got the upper limits with Britain?
Is it like... Well, I mean, the United States, I'm sure, but like, is France also included in that?
Somehow, no. It's just the U.S. and Britain.
Seems strange.
I think Japan gets like the same as France.
Well, yeah, we trust them, so yeah. So I guess question-wise, in the 1920s, are aircraft carriers a thing that starts rolling out like right after World War I? Then
I think so. I'm not super.
I've seen like early pictures of rudimentary aircraft carriers.
I think so. The Langley is the first aircraft carrier in the U.S. Navy, and that's in 1922.
Okay, that's like way earlier than I thought aircraft carriers were even like a thing.
That's it's like a converted collier. It's not even
like into like World War II. I know especially some of the Japanese carriers were essentially halted sort of midway through production, shifted into being aircraft carriers. So they are essentially a battleship with a flat top.
Yeah. But obviously they can kind of see where the future's going. That is another vessel that they limit. At this point, battleships, battlecruisers are kind of still king. That's quickly changing. We'll see it change in a matter of months.
We're gonna see why.
So vessels under 10,000 tons of displacement are exempt from these regulations. So you're talking cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Some countries will really embrace the submarine.
I assume Germany's not exempt from this.
They have their own little rules they have to play by.
I know some of their restrictions on submarines are from the Treaty of Versailles rather than.
Well, they're not included in this. Okay. They're not part of the Washington Naval Treaty.
Okay, that makes sense.
They have their rules under the Treaty of Versailles.
Okay.
So this treaty would be modified under the London Naval Treaties of 1930 and 1936. I think they were just efforts to try to update, fine-tune some things, maybe keep people happy. However, by the mid-1930s, Japan and Italy make it clear that they're no longer going to abide by this treaty. At the same time, Germany announces that they will no longer follow the naval limits set out in the Treaty of Versailles. So Italy, Japan, and Germany all want to act up at one time.
It's almost like they're forming an axis of evil.
Axis of evil. So Britain is quickly faced with a problem. And this is kind of weird. They sort of actually played by the rules. They didn't cheat. I'm sure they did, but not as much as other places. And they find themselves with a lack of modern battleships.
Is this also maybe related to the fact that they are somewhat confident as sort of the world leader in naval matters and feel like maybe they can catch up quickly if they need to?
That, and I think also who would have predicted Japan's rapid industrialization? Plus, I don't think, what Hitler does in Germany is not on anyone's radar either, probably. I just think they probably thought that they didn't have anything to worry about, within reason. But with escalations globally, it quickly becomes apparent that they need modern capital ships. One of the reasons I think that they were a little complacent is because of what they end up doing. They order a new class of battleships, and work begins on the King George V class. So, due to this class being designed to conform to previous naval treaties, her largest guns were limited to 14 inches. This class would be the only one built at the time that actually adhered to the standards.
This is like racing in the Tour de France totally clean in like 1997.
This is largely due to the class being too far along in design plans to change. They knew that they didn't have time to scrap the plans and start over. I just think it's wild that your plans didn't have the built-in secret option of like, but what if we don't follow it?
I think everybody probably assumed that someone else had the secret plans.
Right? And then it comes time to do it. Like, well, what do you mean we got to listen to the rules? Senator Collins is very concerned that the British Navy is following the rules. In total, there would be 5 vessels in the class, 4 of which would survive World War II. We have King George V. She's actually originally to be named King Edward VIII, but that was no longer suitable for reasons.
It would have been funny if they had used a big battleship named after a Nazi in World War II.
Additionally, there was the Prince of Wales, Duke of York, Anson, and Howe. Boo, Howe.
What is Anson? Who is that?
Another admiral of some sort.
I'll say, like, the others make sense. And then you got Anson.
I think it's funny that we kind of joke about Edward VIII, but just to show you how, like, tied up these royal families are, the official motto of the Prince of Wales is, I'm going to try this in German, Ich dien, which means I serve.
Oh, ich dien?
Yeah, that's the official motto of the Prince of Wales. So interesting. I hate when family fights.
I'll drop the Rammstein instead of Ishville.
Ich dien. So the declaration of war against Germany on September 3rd, 1939, forced them to accelerate the production schedule for the HMS Prince of Wales. She would not even be fully operational when she saw her first action.
Like the Death Star.
Yeah, pretty much. Now, we'll get to a Death Star-like explosion here in a minute. While in a semi-complete state, she was on the receiving end of a German air raid. One of the bombs falls close enough that it lands only feet away from her deck, and it actually explodes in the wet basin of the dry dock that she's next to. But the concussion from that causes some of her outer shell plating to buckle, and she bursts a bunch of rivets along a 25-foot section. This results in flooding on the port outboard compartments, and she ends up listing about 10 degrees. Fortunately, shipyard employees and local firefighters are able to control the flooding. They contain it, and the vessel is moved to a new facility, repaired and finished up. But yeah, she's not even fully born yet, and she is already coming under fire.
You got to get the Prince of Wales some action, before he really takes the reins. So
there's going to be another prince that shows up eventually here.
Is it Prince Eugen?
It might be.
Okay.
And his friend Bismarck.
There's a lot of Prince Eugens in the Germanic navies.
On May 22nd, 1941, the Prince of Wales, along with HMS Hood and 6 destroyers, are tasked with finding and preventing the German battleship Bismarck from breaking out into the Atlantic. The Bismarck is pretty hyped up at this time. It is a feared thing. If this thing can get out into the Atlantic and raid commerce, it could be a very difficult thing to deal with because it can essentially hide and show up anywhere. So the task force is to be stationed south of Iceland and intercept them. One interesting note here is that the captain of the Prince of Wales, John Leach, he's worried about the functionality of her main guns. He requested that the technicians from Vickers Armstrong's company stay aboard to assist with troubleshooting.
Troubleshooting and German shooting.
These technicians had already been busy fixing issues after a brief shakedown cruise at Scapa Flow. But again, Britain's pressed for time. They don't have time to do as much QA as you'd like to do. So bring the techs with you. On May 23rd, reports come in that Bismarck, along with heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, are streaming southwest in the Denmark Straits. At 2000 hours, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, on board the Hood, ordered the force to steam on a course to intercept the Nazi vessels.
All right, so we've got this episode so far. We've got Percival, we've got Lancelot, we've got a whole round table.
There's some good names in this one. Anytime you got British Navy, you got good names. The Vice Admiral's plan was for the Prince of Wales and Hood to focus on the Bismarck, while the attached cruisers Norfolk and Suffolk would be tasked with engaging the Prince Eugen. Essentially, they want to go kill the big prize and keep the Prince Eugen distracted. Around 0200 hours on May 24th, the destroyers were dispatched to screen and locate the position of the German vessels. I think it's really interesting how destroyers get used before radar is really a thing. They essentially are scouts and screens and stuff. There's a little bit of a chess game involved in naval warfare at this point. It's very interesting.
Or like a game of Battleship.
At 2:47, the Prince of Wales and Hood increased their speed to 28 knots and made a course change to improve their angle of attack.
Look at us go! We are zooming!
I told you, we're hauling ass!
We're hauling ass! Alrighty!
Guess what I got back there?
You just told me. Ass! We're hauling ass!
No, that's just an expression.
Weather continued to improve with visibility at 10 miles as the sun came up. Crews were ordered to action stations at 5:10 that morning. Keep that in mind, 5:10.
5:10.
At 5:37, enemy contact is reported, and the British capital ships made another course change to close range. There's a few things working against the British ships in this attack. The Hood, although a source of pride in the British Navy, is 25 years old. She lacks adequate deck armor against modern guns, which could lead to shells with like a plunging trajectory to basically be a kill shot. It'll pierce right through and explode in the inside of the ship.
Right.
To counter this, kind of like a fighter who's going to get someone with a bigger reach, she would have to close the distance rapidly to mitigate any plunging fire. So if you can step inside of that fire, you can actually fight.
We are bringing back ramming tactics.
Additionally, the Hood had recently been overhauled, but her crew had not been adequately trained on new systems. So, it might be a process that you're super familiar with, but if they go in and change your, if you're working retail, they change your point of sale system or something like that, you know what to do, but you may not know how to do it. So basically that's what they're dealing with. They're not at optimal strength necessarily. On board the Prince of Wales, there's less concern about plunging shells as she has newer deck armor. However, her crew is also relatively inexperienced. If you think about it, she just recently got launched. That wasn't that long ago.
Well, and especially this early in the war, I'd imagine that most of the crews, in terms of real combat, are pretty inexperienced.
Yeah, I would have to think at this point. British ships made another course change at 5:49. However, this would reveal a problem. The British vessel's angle of attack was too shallow, and neither British vessel could use their aft main guns. So neither one is able to basically fire a full broadside. Situations like this, every shell matters.
Mm-hmm.
Prince Eugen, with Bismarck behind her, were both in a position to deliver full broadsides. So they've really put themselves in a bad spot here. At 5:43, Prince of Wales opened fire on the Bismarck at a range of about 26,000 yards. So what is that, like 10 miles, something like that?
Let's see, yards to miles. What is this, 26? That is about 14 3/4 of a mile.
Yeah, that's a long ways. Like, it's pretty wild how far some of these engagements take place.
I remember reading in the final of the Ian Toll, when he's talking about the Yamato, how it is, I believe it's the Yamato, that's credited with possibly the longest, either longest hit or the longest kill shot in naval history. It's like 20 miles or something, where it, like, one of the only times it fires its guns in anger, it does actually manage to severely damage something, at a huge distance. Hey, Tanner here. I was able to find the specific spot in Ian Toll's Twilight of the Gods from Chapter 6, where he details this super long range shot from the battleship Yamato. And this is part of the Battle off Samar, which is itself part of the larger Battle of Leyte Gulf. Also in this excerpt, Toll will be referring to the American vessel White Plains, which is one of those smaller escort carriers. So reading here from page 264. At that great range, the long barrels of the Yamato's mammoth main guns were trained forward and elevated to 23 degrees. Propelled by 6 great jets of flame and smoke, 6 armor-piercing projectiles spun out of the muzzles and began climbing toward the distant target. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds. After 25 seconds of flight, midway to impact, the shells reached the apex of their trajectories, about 20,000 feet above sea level. Then they began descending at a terminal velocity of about 1,500 feet per second, significantly less than the initial muzzle velocity, but still much faster than the speed of sound. From the American point of view, therefore, no whining or whistling announced the incoming salvo. They did not learn they were under fire until 6 whitewater towers suddenly erupted off the starboard beam of the carrier White Plains. Each matched the height of a 20-story building. The towers dissolved only gradually, as cataracts of spray fell to leeward. Half a minute after impact, 6 ghost columns of vapor still hovered over the spots where the monstrous shells had struck. No ship in Taffy 3 was armed with weapons greater than 5-inch caliber, so the Americans could not return fire at this range. They could only run for their lives. But they couldn't run especially fast. Even with all the boilers on the line, some of the CVEs in the group could barely make 17 knots. Sprague later admitted, "I didn't think we'd last 15 minutes." The Yamato's second salvo, fired less than a minute after the first, bracketed the White Plains with a close straddle. The baby flat top vanished momentarily behind a wall of spray. She surged ahead, seemingly intact, but the Yamato's near misses sent destructive shock waves through the lightly constructed ship. Rivets tore loose, welds ripped open, electric power cut out, interior lighting was doused, radio transmitters and receivers were disabled, radar screens flickered out, and a table on the bridge fell over when one of its legs buckled. As the sheets of spray fell across the White Plains flight deck, the Yamato's third salvo arrived. The 6-shell pattern fell microscopically close, according to Captain Dennis J. Sullivan, who added, "The vessel was shaken and twisted violently, throwing personnel in some parts of the ship from their feet and much gear to the deck from normal horizontal storage. One of the shells burrowed into the sea and detonated beneath the ship, on the port side near the keel. According to the after-action report, the ship twisted and lifted, crushing and tearing expansion joints at frame 101 and 146 port and starboard. The shock of the blast tore hull plates asunder beneath the waterline, cut the steering control leads, warped interior decks and bulkheads, and sprung oil and aviation gasoline leaks throughout the ship. On the flight deck, a Wildcat preparing to launch jumped its wheel chocks and lurched forward, where its propeller took a bite out of the wing of the next aircraft ahead. 2 of the ship's 4 boilers suffered a sudden reduction in steam pressure. If the submerged projectile had exploded a few feet aft, it might have flooded the engineering spaces and left the White Plains dead in the water, in which case the ship would have been left to the mercy of the fast-approaching enemy. The Type 1 armor-piercing projectile fired by the Yamato had been purposely designed to dive under a ship if it landed in the sea short of the target. This round had functioned as intended, maintaining a linear underwater trajectory and detonating 0.4 seconds after surface impact. Though it did not make physical contact with the ship, its blast force was directed upward into the vulnerable part of the hull. In this respect, the Type 1 projectile had behaved like a mine or an American torpedo fused with a magnetic detonator, designed to trigger the warhead when the weapon was directly beneath the ship. In his meticulous analysis of the battle off Samar, The World Wondered, Robert Lundgren proposes that the Yamato's third salvo should be credited as a hit on the White Plains. If the claim is accepted, the Yamato holds the singular honor of scoring the longest-ranged naval gunfire hit in history, 34,587 yards, or nearly 20 miles.
Yeah, these distances are pretty amazing, especially for just a gun, not even dealing with like a guided missile or anything like that. The weather did not help this situation, as seas are breaking over the bows of the British ships. There's also some confusion on the British side as to which vessel is actually the Bismarck. The Hood had mistakenly fired on Prince Eugen 30 seconds before the Prince of Wales would deliver her first volley. Hood's first shots were close, but scored no hits. In less than 3 minutes, the Prince Eugen had already returned fire and scored a hit on the Hood with her 8-inch guns. Prince of Wales' first volley on the Bismarck missed by over 1,000 yards. This lack of accuracy is partially due to the Prince of Wales not being able to use her turret rangefinders due to those waves breaking over the deck, but also just an inexperienced crew that's probably really amped up for battle, and you're also going against the Bismarck, which it's been hyped up in the media that this is the biggest and baddest thing that the Nazis can throw at you. As the battle progressed, Prince of Wales was able to score 2 hits on Bismarck. The first would pierce her bow and cause her to lose over 1,000 tons of oil. The second one would fall short and enter the vessel below her side belt armor. This caused flooding of her auxiliary boiler machinery room and would shut down 2 of her boilers. During the attack, the Prince of Wales suffered from various issues with her main guns. So this is the thing that the captain had been worried about. As a matter of fact, the A1 gun, which I'm not sure what position that is, actually malfunctions after the initial salvo. So they're immediately down a gun to start this engagement. So the German vessels would counterattack by targeting Hood. Kind of the same strategy of let's work together to take out one of these ships and then you have odds on your side. So they would fire multiple salvos of 8 and 15-inch guns, and this would have an almost immediate impact. An 8-inch shell ignited a service locker for ammunition, and fire began to engulf the superstructure of the vessel. At 5:58, Hood began to turn 20 degrees to port in order to bring her full battery of guns to bear on Bismarck. So this is a pretty crazy scene. The Hood's on fire. It's burning from its superstructure, but it's also turning to try to fire a broadside as all this is going on. This sort of has like all the drama of the classic Age of Sail.
Well, yeah, especially because like this is, we're getting to the point where this is one of the last times that battleships will just fire at each other, like just straight up. It's sort of like end of an era type stuff here.
Yeah, it really is. So as Hood begins this turn, Bismarck opens fire with her 3rd and 4th salvos from her main gun. At 6:01, Bismarck fires a 5th salvo, which results in a large explosion on board Hood. Flames would shoot up her mast, and the Hood appeared to collapse amidship. Basically, it's a catastrophic explosion. We could probably talk about the Hood in another episode and do it more justice, but it's quick when it happens. In total, 1,419 officers and enlisted personnel are lost, and only 3 men would survive when the Hood went down.
Wow.
That's one of those that always gets me. That
I had no idea that the Hood was such a like a catastrophic loss of life.
Yeah, you think about all the things that the British have already gone through at this point, and that they will still go through, and like something like this happens.
Yeah, it's not over. It's not over.
Yeah. So Prince of Wales had been firing on the German vessels unopposed until she began to turn to port at 5:57. That's because they were focused on the Hood. After the Hood exploded at 6:01, the German vessels shifted their focus, opening up with 15, 9, and 5.9-inch guns. Prince of Wales would suffer multiple hits, including a 15-inch shell that struck the starboard side of her compass platform. That actually kills a few people that are stationed up there.
Is the compass platform like what it sounds
kind of
like?
By the bridge, yeah, essentially.
Okay. Just imagine like a big sundial-sized compass.
Another 15-inch shell plunged through the ship, impacting below the armor belt amidship. However, the shell did not explode, and it actually remained lodged in the ship. They didn't even find it until they went to do repairs. Captain Leach decided at 6:05 to put down a heavy smoke screen to cover her escape. Leach then radioed the destroyer Norfolk and told her that Hood had been sunk, and she went to join Suffolk about 15 miles astern of Bismarck.
Hood is like really sunk.
What time did I tell you to remember?
5:37, 47.
Was it 5? I think it was 5:10.
5:10, that sounds right.
So that's when the Hood's crew is summoned to battle stations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So from 5:10 to 6:01. That's how quickly you go from being in your bunk, sleeping, to best case scenario, you're one of the three guys in the water. Like that's wild how quickly that happens.
I wonder, I mean, I'm sure someone does, but I wonder, were the three in like a similar part of the ship? Or
that's a good question.
Totally random?
It's almost more scary if it's totally random.
Yeah. So
from this position, the British vessels would continue to pursue the German vessels. Suffolk would spot Bismarck at 18:16 hours. Then the Prince of Wales opened fire at an extended range of 30,000 yards. This is like the absolute extreme of her effective range, and no hits were scored.
17 miles.
Early, around 1 o'clock on May 25th, the Prince of Wales regained contact and opened fire at 20,000 yards. Observers believe they had scored a hit. However, due to mechanical issues, the Prince of Wales was only left with 6 operational guns. So, yet again, more gun issues. With weather deteriorating, the Bismarck was lost and could not be located again, despite a 12-hour search. Prince of Wales then made way for Iceland. In total, 13 of her crew had been killed, while 9 were wounded. So she definitely kind of gets a baptism by fire here. Like she immediately gets thrown into it with being part of this.
Is this, because I know the Bismarck is eventually sunk, does that happen like later in this engagement?
Not necessarily like this engagement, but like, I don't know. I remember the exact timeline, but it's within days.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the last battle of the Bismarck, May 26th to 27th. So yeah, looks like a couple days.
Yeah, this is kind of like the first blood. So yeah, I mean, that's a lot though to watch the Hood go down like that in your first real deployment. That would be quite the shock to the system.
Oh, there is a Bismarck connection to a previous episode. I believe Nick made this connection a while back, but the last captain of the Bismarck, Gunther Lutyens, was one of the captains we talked about of the Karlsruhe in our Nazi salute for the Alamo Dead episode.
I did not know that. That is an interesting connection. After the action against the Bismarck, the Prince of Wales would undergo repairs at the dockyards in Rosyth, Scotland. Her next task would be to carry the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, across the Atlantic for the Atlantic Conference with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She would arrive in Newfoundland on August 9th. FDR had actually been there since the 7th, and it was interesting reading about this. He had boarded multiple vessels and had the presidential yacht, the Potomac, steaming up and down the New England coast that kind of like to pretend that he was on a sightseeing tour when he's really off meeting with Churchill. Because you have to remember, the United States is not in World War II yet. The conference concluded on August 12th, and the Prince of Wales was back in Scapa Flow by the 18th. Next, she would find herself assigned to Force H in the Mediterranean Sea. On September 24th, she formed a Group 2, led by Vice Admiral Albna Curtis.
I think it's Albin.
Albin? Oh,
Mhm.
Albin Curtis?
Obama.
On September 24th, she formed Group 2, led by Vice Admiral Albin Curtis. The main task was to provide convoy escort to supply convoys moving from Gibraltar to Malta. This is something I didn't know a lot about until fairly recently. I watched one of those World War II in color or HD or whatever. There's a million of them now.
Mm-hmm.
But they had a lot of footage from this. And there's some pretty intense naval engagements in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, that's definitely not a part of the war that gets a lot of coverage.
So on September 27th, the convoy Prince of Wales is escorting comes under attack from Italian aircraft. The crews on board are able to down multiple aircraft with their 5.25-inch guns. And actually later that day, there's reports that an Italian naval force is approaching the convoy. However, it could not be located. The convoy that they were escorting would arrive in Malta without any further incident. The Prince of Wales would then stop back in Gibraltar before returning to Scapa Flow to refit. Things went a little better there. They actually, were able to protect the convoy, score some hits. What comes next?
Well, I mean, they're going up against the Italians.
That is true. Wow, they really got to fight everybody in their brief time. So now we'll go to the Far East. On October 25th, 1941, Prince of Wales departs for Singapore along with escort destroyers. Their initial objective was to link up with the battlecruiser Repulse and the aircraft carrier Indomitable. Indomitable would not make that meeting as she was smart and she grounded herself off of Jamaica and was actually unable to free herself for days.
That sounds pretty domitable to me.
It's kind of like when you see those stories, though, if someone misses their flight, but then their plane crashes. At the time, that probably wasn't good, but then a couple months later, you're like, okay.
Hey, Indomitable, I like you. Don't go to war tomorrow.
Along the way, the Prince of Wales would make stops in Freetown and Cape Town in South Africa. This is for a bit of wartime publicity. Here's the crew that didn't blink when they, face down the Bismarck. You can spin it however you want, Mm-hmm. She would also stop in Mauritius and the Maldives. All kinds of exotic places.
Was just talking about Mauritius with my students because we were talking about ecology. So we were talking about invasive species, and then we were talking about the dodo. So we talked about Mauritius.
The Prince of Wales arrived off Colombo, Ceylon on November 28th, where she would link up with Repulse the next day. Together, they would proceed to Singapore and arrive on December 2nd. Prince of Wales becomes the flagship of Force Z. The force was composed of the Prince of Wales, the Repulse, and multiple destroyers commanded by Sir Tom Phillips.
I know some of our British and I think Canadian listeners would probably call it Force Z.
They might.
I assume that's what it's being referred to as here, but yes, we're going to call it Force Z.
I would assume. I didn't want to appropriate their culture. So the group was going to be tasked with reinforcing colonial possessions in the Far East, basically acting as kind of a deterrent force to those feisty Japanese to be like, hey, don't do anything.
I know that from some of the reading I was doing on this, I know that particularly the Australians and New Zealanders were clamoring for some more some more capital ships to be sent east to give them a little bit more beef. That's not a naval deterrent. This is a naval deterrent.
Let's see. And then did you have some stuff you wanted to bring in here?
Mainly, it was an article by Christopher Bell in the English Historical Review. It was called The Singapore Strategy and the Deterrence of Japan, Winston Churchill, the Admiralty, and the Dispatch of Force Z. So this was a great article. It was, it's like 30-ish pages long, so not a huge read, but it went through some of the pretty in-depth debate that went on in both military and civilian leadership circles in the lead up to this. I had first read about the Prince of Wales and like this part of her story in that Ian Toll trilogy. And
can we start referring to that as the trilogy on our podcast?
The trilogy, the real trilogy. Having read a bit more about it now, it really is interesting the depth that goes into, because I think with a lot of things, like it with World War I, with World War II, any war really, there's always sort of like the popular, widely known story. Usually something silly or dumb that happened early in the war before people knew what they were doing. And this one sort of comes off as how we learned that battleships were done and air power was going to be the new thing in naval warfare. And it's like, to an extent it is, but like there's a lot more to it. It's not just the British sending these ships blind, not understanding the risks. So there was some interesting stuff here. There's a lot more detail in that article. I'll post it in the Discord for anyone who wants it. But you essentially had British naval strategists as early as like the 20s drawing up plans for what a war with Japan would look like. And I assume countries are always doing this. I'm sure.
Yeah, I'd have to imagine you have to kind of like draw it up against everything. What if we did invade Canada?
Yeah, like I'm sure the United States has plans for war with like literally every country on the planet. And so these British plans often included the possibility that a war with Japan would be coupled with a war against a continental European power. So say we can't just load up against Japan because we're going to have to also balance something closer to home. But something that they didn't, and there's no good way to plan for a three-front naval war, even for the British Empire. In this case, Germany in the North Sea and Atlantic, Italy in the Mediterranean, and Japan in the Pacific. So this is going to stretch even their capabilities with what they have. They had that system where they were theoretically trying to stay ahead of, I think it was the next two largest navies. They wanted to have more ships than those next two powers combined, which is, easier said than done. But in August of 1941, Churchill, he had proposed to the Admiralty the potential usefulness of even a small deterrent fleet in the Far East, saying that this force, quote, should consist of the smallest number of the best ships. We have only to remember all the preoccupations which are caused us by the Tirpitz to see what an effect would be produced upon the Japanese Admiralty by the presence of a small but very powerful and fast force in eastern waters. The Tirpitz being, I think, was she the sister vessel of the Bismarck? I think I've seen that before. Churchill kind of using their experience, saying, hey, look how much trouble we're having with the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. We could basically do the same thing to the Japanese.
Right.
And so Churchill wanted this small but very powerful force to include one of the new King George V class. And this is actually met with opposition from the First Lord of the Admiralty, A.V. Alexander. He felt that all of the King George V's were needed for the defense of Britain, and that the presence of only one of these battleships in the East wouldn't do anything to deter Japan in the first place.
Well,
so by Alexander's estimate, a force of at least 6 battleships would be needed at Singapore to deter a major Japanese move to the south. However, kind of this is kind of how deep the chess match goes, like all of these factors, is that, any Japanese force big enough to challenge this proposed fleet of Alexander's would naturally have to draw enough resources away from Japan to leave the islands exposed to attack from the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. Again, U.S. is not even in the war at this point, and they're including these contingency plans.
I guess they figure if it's kicking off that big, we're going to be, which... Right.
Yeah, and they really are going in. They really are relying on the fact that we're going to have the U.S. on our side sooner or later in the Pacific. Yeah, so that was some interesting stuff that I found there. I have a few more little excerpts that I pulled out for later, but that was an interesting bit of some of the behind the scenes of this, of how, this, first of all, this isn't a unity decision on the part of Britain. There's military concerns that go into it. The Admiralty would prefer in some ways to send nothing, saying,
Mhm.
if we're just sending these over there to get steamrolled in the event that things do kick off, we might as well just keep them at home.
Here. Yeah.
On the civilian side of things, you can understand that would be terrible for morale to
Just give up.
to send no support, especially when you've got Australia and New Zealand begging for something to keep the Japanese hopefully at bay. So yeah, it is an interesting example of how when waging a war, it isn't just the military elements of it that go into these decisions. You do have civilians making a lot of these decisions as well. And so those concerns have to be weighed in that equation.
So that brings us to December 6th. Force Z is sighted by a Japanese troop convoy. So the Japanese are aware that that the Prince of Wales is operating in the area. 2 days later, on December 8th, the Japanese launched an air raid on Singapore, which, if I'm not mistaken, this would be December 7th in the United States.
They were coordinated, right? I mean, obviously they were coordinated.
Yeah, I think they,
but
within reason, as much as they could have coordinated them to go off pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So Prince of Wales would contribute to the air defense of the city with her anti-aircraft guns. However, she's unable to down any aircraft. That evening, Admiralty in London orders Force Z to engage Japanese targets. So the war is on. Admiral Phillips orders Force Z to set sail that evening. And at this time, Force Z is composed of the Prince of Wales, the battlecruiser Repulse, along with destroyers Electra, Express, Tenedos, and Vampire.
I know Repulse is a battle cruiser. Is she new or old? Is she also a new vessel?
That's a good question. I actually didn't look into her at all.
HMS Repulse. Oh, was she built in 1916?
Not that new then.
Yeah, I see her fate here on Wikipedia, and this is that one. So, yeah. All right, she's quite old.
So their objective is to attack Japanese transport vessels off of Kota Baru, Malaysia. From Bert Wynn, able seaman on the Repulse, as quoted in Ian Toll's Pacific Crucible.
The main topic of conversation was how long it would take us to sink the Japanese warships felt to be in attendance around the coast of Singora. I still remember the feeling of absolute confidence running through the ship. The outcome of such an engagement was felt to be a formality.
However, the British group is spotted by the Japanese submarine I-65, and in the evening they're spotted again by recon aircraft. As the day had progressed, it became clear that there would be limited RAF support for air cover. So we're already starting to see things kind of fall apart.
Japanese submarine I-65 runs mostly between Chicago and Indianapolis.
Gets a little icy up there sometimes in the winter. Around midnight on December 10th, reports come in the Japanese forces are landing at Kuntan, Malaya. Force Z is routed to investigate this. You have to figure at this point, there's probably reports flying all over the place about what the Japanese are up to.
This part, there's some references later in some of this other stuff I was reading. When it says they're rerouted to investigate, do they have any idea what they're sailing into?
I don't think so. I mean, think about how garbled information gets now and how much slower it moves here. They're probably jumping at everything. So a Japanese submarine reported sighting Force Z at 0211 before arriving off of Kuntan at 8 in the morning. It's at this point it becomes clear that the reports of the landings are diversion. So the whole time it feels like the Japanese are just watching this happen, basically.
A diversion. Are there actual landings taking place, or is this pure fabrication or misinformation?
I think it's probably just misinformation that Japan's putting out to, I'm sure, obscure an attack somewhere else, but also just to confuse and lock up, any sort of strategic planning that's going on. So a few hours later, around 11 in the morning, the Japanese began their first of multiple air assaults. At 11, 8 Type 96 Nell bombers set their sights on Repulse. So this whole time, it's sort of been to lure them just out into the open so that they can attack.
Some fine find Mitsubishi products.
Yes, you're about to see a few different Mitsubishi products here. One of the bombs would pierce the hangar roof and would explode on the main deck of the Repulse, so not off to a good start. But you know what's better than dropping bombs on ships? Dropping torpedoes at ships.
Perfect.
The second wave would begin their attack around 11:30. This consisted of 17 Type 98s. However, this time they're armed with torpedoes. Also, since there's 17 of them, they split into two groups. One formation will attack the Prince of Wales, while the other goes after Repulse. One of the torpedoes found the Prince of Wales. It impacted the port side. This destroyed the outer propeller shaft and bulkheads that ran along the shaft, and this resulted in a rapid and uncontrolled flooding. This quickly results in a heavy list, and it also results in a loss of power to the aft section of the ship.
These Japanese planes, these are land-based fighters, or land-based planes, right?
Correct. They're Navy planes, but they are land-based Navy planes. But they are designed to do maritime ops, so they are made to do this.
My question was because, do the Japanese have a carrier in the area? A carrier in the area, even?
So a third wave would soon arrive with more torpedo bombers. This wave was a little less successful. They would target the Repulse, but did not score any hits. Finally, a fourth wave comes, and this one's carried out with a slightly more modern aircraft. Another fine Mitsubishi product, the Type 1 Betty bomber. The Bettys would be armed with torpedoes, and there would be additional aircraft with bombs as well. So they're kind of throwing whatever they have left. They immediately scored multiple hits on the Repulse, and she would actually be under the water by 12:33 that afternoon. Due to this quick success, 6 of the bombers changed their target to the Prince of Wales. 3 of their torpedoes would find their mark, which just results in catastrophic flooding at this point. You're already dealing with the first one, and 3 more do not help your cause. But it's a big ship, and boats want to float. So the final blow would come from an 1,100-pound bomb, which would hit the catapult deck and penetrate the main deck before exploding near a makeshift aid station that had been set up on board. Kind of just a bomb that hits the right spot, finally, is what breaks her back. Bombs would continue to fall around the stricken vessel, and these concussions would cause rivets to pop and snap and more seams to open up. So literally the vessel is falling apart at this point. At 13:15 hours, orders are given to abandon ship. She would quickly capsize and roll over at 13:20 before going under. This stuff happens quick. Admiral Phillips and Captain Leach were among the 327 men who did not make it off the stricken vessel. It's a bad day. This is another bad day in British maritime history. The Prince of Wales got to be there for 2 of the worst. Also, in kind of a twisted bit of history, the air cover that had been assigned to Force Z would arrive on scene at 13:18 hours, literally just in time to watch the Prince of Wales go under, but not assist her in any way because they were fighter planes. That has to be a bad feeling.
Did you find anything about what was their air cover late? Was it just poor coordination? Did they not know where they were?
I think poor coordination / not knowing where they were. Again, everyone's panicked in the beginning of this thing. As the war in the Pacific is all of a sudden kicking off everywhere all at once. So a little bit of the aftermath of this. The destroyers Electra and Vampire worked to rescue the Repulse survivors that were in the water, while Express would work the Prince of Wales scene. In total, 571 men would be rescued from the Repulse. So they're actually able to somewhat successfully abandon ship, I guess, in these situations. Vampire would retrieve 9 officers, 213 enlisted, a civilian war correspondent, and 2 sailors from the Prince of Wales as well. The senior survivor of the Prince of Wales was Lieutenant Commander A.G. Skipworth. This was the ship's first lieutenant.
Oh, wow. That's pretty far down. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not great. Captain Tennant of the Repulse would survive, and upon reaching Singapore, he would be greeted by Air Vice Marshal Pulfor, who said,
My God, I hope you don't blame me for this. I had no idea where you were.
There's also a quote here from Flight Lieutenant Tim Viggers. He's actually one of the pilots who's on scene that day that shows up like right as this is going down. He appeared in an interview in the London Gazette.
It was obvious that the 3 destroyers were going to take hours to pick up those hundreds of men clinging to bits of wreckage and swimming around in the filthy, oily water. Above all this, the threat of another bombing and machine gun attack was imminent. Every one of those men must have realized that. Yet, as I flew around, every man waved and put up his thumb as I flew over him. After an hour, lack of petrol forced me to leave. But during that hour, I had seen many men in dire danger, waving, cheering, and joking, as if they were holidaymakers at Brighton, waving at a low-flying aircraft. It shook me, for here was something above human nature.
So the destruction of the Prince of Wales and Repulse via the air, it's kind of a signal of what is to come in naval warfare. An emphasis on the projection of air power versus the biggest or most armored battleships. Prince of Wales had literally become a relic during her short time at war.
Actually, we sort of talked about it, I guess, the contrast in our episode about the Tornado, sort of contrasting Tornado with the Alabama, but how the Alabama doesn't have a very long career, but she kind of gets to do everything that you'd hope to get to do if you were a ship.
Right.
And the Prince of Wales has a really short career, but does and is kind of one of the last battleships that gets to do all of the battleship things.
Even sink.
Yeah, like gets to actually, be engaged in, ship to ship combat. And yeah, like it does go through this relicization process just during her lifespan.
Let's see here. So from Pacific Crucible, detailing the conversation between Churchill and Admiral Sir Dudley Pound.
Are you sure it's true? The Prime Minister asked. There's no doubt at all, Pound replied. As he put the receiver back in its cradle, Churchill later wrote, I was glad to be alone. In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. As I turned over and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank upon me. Over all this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere, weak and naked.
That's pretty accurate as to how that stands in the Pacific at this very moment.
Okay, so I do just want to contrast that quote with another Winston Churchill quote from that Christopher Bell article. It's going to be like on Twitter when someone will screenshot
this you.
So yeah. This you. So yeah, the this you moment is as Chancellor of the Exchequer during the 1920s, Churchill was already inclined to downplay the Japanese threat to British interests. A war with Japan? But why should there be a war with Japan? I don't believe there's the slightest chance of it in our lifetime. Japan is at the other end of the world. She cannot menace our vital security in any way. The only war it would be worth our while to fight would be to prevent an invasion of Australia, and that, I'm certain, will never happen in any period, even the most remote, which we or our children need foresee. I'm therefore convinced that war with Japan is not a reasonable possibility any reasonable government need take into account. He really double quadrupled down on it.
He does.
This you?
So some of the factors that would contribute to the loss of the Prince of Wales. Her surface scanning radar is not suitable for the tropical environment that she was operating in. This was actually a concern that a few people had raised before being told to not worry about it. This is her biggest technological advantage.
What is the problem with being in the tropics?
High humidity. Distorts everything and makes it unusable, essentially. I see. Her biggest piece of technology, and she can't even take advantage of it.
It's just too hot in the radar room.
Let's see here. So also the loss of the ship's dynamos and subsequent blackout on board made the damage control and flooding mitigation operations basically impossible once it began. Additionally, the ship's crew was relatively inexperienced. The ship's anti-aircraft crews in particular did not prove to be effective.
That was something that also happened with the U.S. fleet. I know anti-aircraft fire was a huge problem early in the war, just being really bad at it. And I forget if it was Nimitz or Halsey, one of those big names really made a point of emphasis for his ships to really focus on we need to get better at anti-aircraft fire. And reading about how they practice that is really crazy. Do you know how they practice anti-aircraft fire? By attaching targets to planes and literally just having them drag them behind them. Being that pilot of the practice target plane, sure, I know the thing's probably several hundred yards behind you, but the whole point of this is that these guys suck at anti-aircraft fire.
At this.
The idea of them missing by a few hundred yards is not out of the question.
Let's see here. So we have another quote here from Christopher M. Bell's The Singapore Strategy.
The decision to send the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to Singapore made their destruction possible, even probable, but not inevitable. Churchill may have been unduly optimistic about the ability of such a small squadron to protect British interests in wartime, but this had nothing to do with Philip's decision to seek out enemy targets on December 8th. The recently promoted Phillips lacked war experience and was notorious for underestimating the vulnerability of capital ships to aircraft. A different commander might not have endangered his ships on such a reckless mission. Force Z was destroyed in circumstances which could have been avoided, and in pursuit of objectives which neither the Admiralty nor Churchill had approved. And I don't know, reading that, I feel like the whole point of that article is to sort of set the context for why the ships were there in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just that excerpt sounds very harsh to Captain Phillips. But I think at the same time, another point that he makes is that these ships were, if they were over there, they stood a very good chance of being destroyed.
Right.
It could have been like this. It could have been sitting at Singapore.
Yeah, it was going to happen one way or the other.
It was quite likely that these ships were not anything more than a sort of morale boost.
Right. Best case scenario, maybe you can flee to Australia, but that's absolute best case, I suppose.
Yeah, you can kind of see it. He goes through this in detail, but in the sort of the years leading up to the war itself, and as it looks more and more likely that it isn't just Japan, it would probably be Germany as well, and then, also probably Italy. So now we're going to have to deal with the Mediterranean. And sort of in the initial plans for the specific war, Britain's real debate is not whether or not to send ships to the east, it's are we sending enough to conduct offensive operations against Japan, or are we sending enough just to basically make a defensive shell around Singapore, maybe around Hong Kong if we're feeling saucy,
right?
Ideally, the way that plan gets edited down until it is this just kind of rump of a plan that isn't even really a plan. It's we're going to send some ships over there, and I think another thing timeline wise, as we mentioned, is the declaration of war, the surprise attacks that Japan launches happens after these ships have already been dispatched. So they're not being dispatched to deal with the Japanese threat. They're trying to prevent one. The idea is that hopefully if these ships are there, Japan will think twice or maybe just not do this at all. Obviously that doesn't work, and Japan ends up rolling the dice big time.
Yeah.
Which, kind of defied expectations, but I think that was the biggest takeaway here, is that you kind of have this stereotype of, the European powers didn't respect Japan. They thought that, the Japanese were inferior. And it's that's certainly true to an extent, and to some people more than others. But on a strategic level, you do see some of the rationale for this. Britain knows that they're not sending their best when they send this Force Z. They're just sending something.
Let's see here. And then we have another quote here from Bell.
The Director General of Political Warfare, Robert Bruce Lockhart, recalled that going into the smoking room of his club, crowded with high-ranking naval and military officers, was like entering a Scottish house in which the will is being read after a funeral. There were drinks on the table, but gloom on every face. Officers spoke in low tones. The atmosphere was heavy with the dead weight of tradition. Military defeats are the initial fate of the English in almost every war, and can be borne with stoical courage. A disaster to the Navy is unthinkable and unbearable.
Yeah, it's it is like the biggest shakeup in the Pacific for the British in the entire war. I think this is sort of what leads to the Americans taking on most of the Pacific War. The British just don't have any other ships to send.
It is interesting how that's sort of the effect. Japan scores these early war victories against the U.S. and against Britain. And it is interesting the effect it has, because here, Britain hasn't sent a huge force, and that force is pretty quickly dealt with. The U.S. obviously loses a lot of ships and personnel at Pearl Harbor. But another thing that Toll talks about is how Pearl Harbor had a sort of galvanizing effect on the Navy, not even from like a morale point of view, just the fact that it destroyed or damaged a lot of these big old battleships that weren't going to be the main thrust of the naval war in the first place. So silver lining to Pearl Harbor being it makes the U.S. Navy a little bit smaller, yes, but a lot faster and a lot more dangerous, because it is now wholly committed to these aircraft carriers, and like that is what the decider is going to be going forward. And that really is why Japan's failure to get the carriers, as Yamamoto would be able to tell you, is sort of the already starts sort of building the coffin for Japan here.
Mm-hmm.
They've taken out, the Arizona and the Oklahoma, but it's like that's not what's going to win the war in the first place.
Right, exactly. So moving forward a little bit, let's talk about the wreck today. She lies in 223 feet of water, about 80 miles east of Kuntan. A Royal Navy ensign is attached to the buoy marking the wreck. And the wreck is designated as a protected place under the Protection of Military Remains Act of 1986. It was designated that way in 2001. In 2002, the ship's bell is recovered. This is done with the blessing of the Ministry of Defense, along with some of the Force Z survivors. That bell currently resides at the National Museum of the Royal Navy at Portsmouth Historic Dockyard. That would be a cool museum to go to, by the way. That would have to be up on my list.
Yeah, that would be cool. We should save our Patreon money and
go to Portsmouth.
So 223 feet, like that's way too deep to actually dive on, right?
I think if you're like a skilled diver, you may be able to, but it's not a recreational dive by any means. I think if you were doing salvage work or something, you could probably do it.
Deep diving. It seems like 200 feet is
the limit.
Is really deep.
Deeper than I'd want to go.
Oh, wow. The deepest scuba dive this is using trimix of oxygen, helium, and nitrogen.
Uh-huh.
The deepest scuba dive, 1,089 feet.
Nope.
Jesus.
No, thanks.
Okay, so 223 feet is like
possible, but not easy.
Deep, but like a technical diver could do it.
Yes.
A recreational diver, no. But
correct.
Let's see. 217 feet says depth at which breathing compressed air exposes the diver to an oxygen partial pressure of 1.6 bar or 23 psi. Greater depth is considered to expose the diver to an unacceptable risk of oxygen toxicity. Okay, so you need like technical diving and mixed air. Okay.
So the wreck would again be the subject of international news in 2004. It's reported in the Daily Telegraph that the Prince of Wales and Repulse were subject to extensive damage resulting from scrap metal dealers. So someone's going out there and harvesting metal.
It's probably Watto, and it's a good thing he's dead.
In May of 2023, there were further reports of a Chinese vessel by the name of Chon Hong 68 that they are illegally salvaging at the wreck. And in particular, they're searching for low background steel. This is steel that's made before atomic bomb detonations. Apparently that causes some low-level background contamination in all steel that's produced today.
Well, I know that's why the Scapa Flow wrecks were of interest, because you have this massive deposit of wrecks that is this pre-atomic steel. I do also remember seeing something. I think it was last year that I forget what it was. It was like an update on that. Basically, it was either that problem has either faded over time now that there's like less nuclear testing going on, or I think that's what it was. Is that like now even steel that's like quote unquote contaminated like isn't
right
because
to such a small level.
It was something like that. I don't remember.
Interesting. Actually, as late as July of 2024, the same vessel's been seen operating in the area and accused of similar activity. So, even today, there's still controversy at these wrecks.
Me going back at 2 a.m. for more scrap metal.
Pretty much. This is like the scrappers ripping out the copper of an abandoned building. But yeah, that is the story of the Prince of Wales. It's definitely, as an American, a little bit of a blind spot in our World War II education, kind of in the sense that it's easy to learn about the Battle of Britain or Dunkirk or something like that. But since this is taking place in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, it just doesn't get talked about. But I want to thank everybody for listening. Definitely enjoyed putting this one together. Kind of been on a World War II kick lately, so we'll see if maybe we'll get another one like this. But thanks for listening, and I hope you guys have a great week.